You're standing in the middle of the Sahara Desert, but not the Sahara you're picturing. Not an endless ocean of dead sand. Because it's 7,000 years ago, and right now, this place is alive. There is grass under your feet, stretching to the horizon. There are shallow lakes catching the last light of the evening. There are herds of cattle moving slowly across a green savanna, and the people who own them, tall, dark-skinned herders, are settling in for the night around their fires. And in the middle of their world stands a ring of standing stones that they have hauled upright and set into the earth with great care. As the sky darkens and the first stars come out, one of these herders walks to the circle, stands at a particular stone, and looks along it toward the horizon, checking something in the sky, something they have been tracking and predicting for generations. This place is real. It's called Nabta Playa, in what is now the Nubian desert of southern Egypt. And that ring of stones is one of the oldest astronomical monuments ever discovered anywhere on Earth. It is older than the pyramids of Giza. And here is the fact that should genuinely stop you. It is more than 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. Let that land for a second. When you think of ancient people looking up, measuring the heavens, building great stone monuments to track the sun and the stars, you think of Stonehenge, out on its English plain. That is the image the whole world was handed. But over 1,000 years before the first big stones went up at Stonehenge, herders in the African Sahara had already built a working monument to the sky, and almost nobody ever told you. So how deep does African astronomy actually go? Who were these people watching the stars in a desert that wasn't a desert yet? And how did we end up believing the story of ancient stargazing belonged to somebody else? Let's get into it. First, you have to throw out the picture of the Sahara you carry in your head, because for a huge stretch of prehistory, it simply wasn't there. Scientists call it the African Humid Period. For thousands of years, the Earth's orbit tilted the monsoon rains north, and the region we now call the world's greatest desert turned green. Grasslands, lakes, rivers, rain, animals we'd never associate with the Sahara today, giraffes, gazelles, wild cattle, roamed across it, and people moved in to live off that abundance. We even find their rock art out there in the deep desert, paintings of people swimming in the middle of the Sahara, because when they painted it, there was water. And in this green Sahara, around 9,000 years ago, people arrived at a place called Nabta Playa on the shore of a seasonal lake. They were cattle herders, and cattle were the center of everything. Their wealth, their food, their identity, maybe even their religion. And herding cattle in a land that depended on seasonal rains meant that these people had one overwhelming life-or-death obsession. When will the rains come? Because the rain at Nabta Playa was seasonal. For part of the year, the lake filled and the grass grew and life was possible. For the rest, it was dry. If you were moving hundreds of animals and your whole community across that landscape, knowing when the rains were due wasn't a curiosity. It was survival. Guess wrong, and your herd dies of thirst, and so do you. And the most reliable clock in that entire world, the one thing that never lied about the turning of the seasons, was the sky. So they watched it. And then they did something extraordinary. They built a machine to remember what they saw. That machine is the Nabta Playa stone circle, sometimes called the calendar circle. It's a ring of stones, modest in size, that at first glance might look like a random scatter of rocks. But when archaeologists studied it carefully, they found it was anything but random. Set within the circle are pairs of larger upright stones that form deliberate lines of sight, gaps you can look through, like the sights on a tool. And one of those sight lines points to the horizon at exactly the spot where the sun rises on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the very time of year when, in that place, the life-giving monsoon rains arrived. Think about what that means. These herders had figured out that the sun's rising point drifts along the horizon through the year, back and forth, in a perfectly regular cycle. They had identified the exact extreme of that cycle, the solstice. They understood that this solstice lined up with the coming of the rains, and they built a permanent stone instrument aligned to the horizon to mark it, so that anyone standing in the right place could look along the stones and read the calendar of the sky. This isn't superstition. This is observational astronomy. This is data, collected over many years, turned into a physical tool. 7,000 years ago, in the Sahara. And I want you to sit with just how much patient work is hidden inside that one alignment, because it's easy to say they marked the solstice and miss what it took. The sun doesn't announce the solstice. There's no bell, no flag in the sky. To find it, you have to watch the sunrise day after day and notice where on the horizon it comes up. Then you have to keep watching as that point creeps a little further along the horizon each morning, then slows, then stops, then reverses. And you have to realize that the day it stops and turns is special, and that it happens on a fixed cycle, and that the cycle matches the year and the rains. That is not one clever person's lucky guess. That is generations of careful, sustained, recorded observation, a scientific tradition handed down, refined, and finally frozen into stone so it could never be forgotten. The circle isn't the discovery. The circle is the textbook. The discovery lived in the minds of the people who watched for lifetimes before a single stone was raised. And the sun may be only the beginning, because some researchers who studied Nabta Playa argue that the alignments go further, that other stones in and around the site point toward the rising positions of bright stars. There are claims of sight lines toward stars like Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, and toward the stars of Orion's belt, and others. Now, I'll be honest with you. The star alignments are debated. Some are more certain than others, and scholars argue about which stones point at what. But even the most cautious reading of Nabta Playa leaves you with something astonishing. A society that was carefully, systematically watching the heavens, marking the solstice in stone, and organizing its monuments around the sky. The debate is about how far their astronomy reached. It is not about whether they were doing astronomy. They clearly were. And the calendar circle is not even the biggest thing at Nabta Playa, because these were not simple people who set up a few rocks and wandered off. The site is a whole ceremonial landscape. There are massive stones, some of them weighing tons, that were quarried, dragged across a kilometer or more of ground, and set up deliberately. There are long alignments of these megaliths radiating out across the site, and there are strange, elaborate structures buried under the earth, stone chambers, and beneath them the buried remains of cattle entombed with enormous care. And you have to picture the sheer labor of it, because there were no wheels here. No metal tools, no draft machines. Moving a stone that weighs several tons across a kilometer of ground is a monumental act of organized human will. It means many people working together under some kind of direction for a shared purpose that mattered enough to justify the effort, dragging these giants on sledges and rollers, levering them upright, setting them just so. One of the great buried stones at the site appears to have been shaped by human hands into a form some researchers read as a sculpted image, possibly of a cow. A carved megalith, deliberately fashioned and then entombed beneath the earth. Whether or not that reading is exactly right, the message is the same. This was a people who could imagine something, plan it, organize hundreds of hands around it, and carve their beliefs into stone heavier than a truck. In the middle of the Sahara. Before the wheel. Before writing. Before Egypt. That last detail tells you so much. These herders didn't just eat their cattle, they revered them. They buried them in roofed stone chambers as if they were royalty in a landscape organized around the sky. You are looking at the remains of a religion, a cattle cult tied to the seasons, tied to the stars, expressed in megalithic stone, thousands of years before anyone wrote a word of history. This was a sophisticated, organized, spiritually complex society doing large-scale coordinated construction in the middle of the African continent at a time when most of the human world was doing nothing of the kind. So how does a monument this important end up as a footnote, while Stonehenge is a household name across the entire planet? Part of it is simply where it is. Stonehenge sits in the green, accessible heart of England, studied for centuries, visited by millions. Nabta Playa sits in one of the most remote, brutal deserts on Earth, and it wasn't even rediscovered by researchers until the second half of the 20th century. For most of modern history, nobody knew it was there. But part of it is the same old pattern we keep running into. The story of human achievement that got written down and taught for generations placed the great firsts, the first cities, the first writing, the first astronomy, the first monuments, anywhere but sub-Saharan and African contexts. When people imagined ancient astronomers charting the heavens, the picture in the textbook was Europe, or the Near East, or later civilizations. A group of black African cattle herders building a solar observatory in the Sahara 1,000 years before Stonehenge did not fit the story that had already been decided. And so, even after it was found, Nabta Playa stayed on the far margins of public knowledge, a specialist's curiosity, while the more comfortable monument kept the fame. And here's what makes it sting even more. The people of Nabta Playa may not have simply vanished, because around 6,000 years ago the rains began to fail. The African Humid Period ended. The green Sahara dried out, slowly and then completely, and it became the desert we know now. And the people who had lived there had to move. Many of them moved to the one place that still had reliable water, east, to the valley of the Nile. Now think about what those migrants would have been carrying in their heads. A cattle-centered religion, a deep tradition of watching the sky, knowledge of the solstice and the seasons, experience building in megalithic stone and aligning monuments to the heavens, and a reverence for cattle powerful enough to bury them like kings. Move that whole package into the Nile Valley, let it simmer for 1,000 years, and look at what ancient Egypt becomes. A civilization obsessed with the sun, ruled by solar kings, worshipping a great cow goddess, aligning colossal stone monuments to the movements of the heavens. Many scholars see Nabta Playa as one of the deep roots of that civilization, a seedbed out in the green Sahara, for ideas that would later blossom on the Nile. The astronomers of the desert may have been the ancestors, in blood or in ideas, of the astronomers of the pyramids. So let's go back, one last time, to that herder, standing at the stone circle in the green Sahara, looking along the stones as the stars come out. They are not a primitive figure at the dawn of everything. They are an astronomer. They are standing inside a tool their people built to hold their knowledge of the sky, a tool older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than almost anything we usually think of when we think of ancient science. They know the sun's path. They know the season of the rains. They may know the great stars by name and by their risings. And they are passing all of it down, generation to generation, written not on paper but in stone and in memory, under one of the darkest, richest skies any human has ever stood beneath. So, did Africans study the stars before Stonehenge? Yes. In a desert that was once a garden, a people who followed the cattle and watched the sky raised stones to the sun 1,000 years before Salisbury Plain, and organized a whole sacred world around the turning of the heavens. Then their green world died, and they carried their sky knowledge east, toward the river where history would remember to start the story. But a few thousand years too late to give them the credit. The lake is gone now, story lovers. The grass is gone. The cattle are gone. But the stones are still standing out there in the sand, still pointing at the place on the horizon where the sun comes up on the longest day. A message from the world's first astronomers, patient as starlight, waiting for us to finally look up and understand what they were telling us all along. And now you know to look.